There's over 60 games in the MEAC slate in 2025, but these 8 will define the season. Oh yeah, it's Locked On HBCU. Play my music.
You are Locked On HBCU, your daily podcast covering HBCU sports. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's going on, family? Welcome back to another episode of the Locked On HBCU podcast, your number one daily one-stop shop for everything HBCU athletics, Monday through Friday. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And I, of course, am Darrion Gray, a.k.a. the Mouth of the South, Texas Southern alum and former TSU Herald Sports editor and current site expert at Who Dat Dish and contributing writer at USA Today Saints Wire. Thank you for going on this journey with me, making Locked On HBCU your first listen of the day every day. And remember, just because the mic cuts off does not mean that the journey is over. It just means it's time to follow me on Twitter at South Exclusives. Starts with an S and ends with an S. Today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app. Create an account and use the code LOCKEDONCollege to get $20 off your first purchase. We'll wrap up today's episode with a look at preseason football, by far the most important time for, I'd say, probably 90% of our former HBCU football players. And while you may have gotten rid of him, he will not stay gone for long. Eric Dooley is back in the mix, and it appears he is a member of the Edward Waters coaching staff. But I thought that this was a very interesting topic to start our episode, and that is, what are the 8 games from the MEAC slate that define the season? Now, I got this from HBCU Sports. I'm going to read through the games that they lined up. Now, the article does call it 7 games, but 1 week or one headline got 2 games. So I'm going to call it 8 because that's what it feels like to me. But this is a fantastic article written by HBCU Sports, and we're going to go through it. So shout out to Chris Stevens for coming up with this idea. And I think that these, honestly, are some of the best games to pick. You may be able to point to this one or that one, but I would argue that it's hard to discount any of the games that are on this list. Maybe you want to expand the number to 10 or 15, whatever, but I think that these 7 are definitely pivotal matchups in the MEAC, and not just as far as deciding the conference. Great example here, North Carolina Central versus Southern in week 0. At the end of the day, remember, this is 8 games that are going to define the season. And the MEAC-SWAC Challenge is always going to be a definitive game. It's just like the Celebration Bowl. You can't put that on the list because you don't know who's going to play. But we do know who's going to play in the MEAC-SWAC Challenge every year. I think they have this lined up to 2027, 2028 maybe. But this year in 2025, you're going to see the Eagles versus the Jaguars, North Carolina Central versus Southern. And this is a game to me. This is a game to me that is going to say a lot about both teams. You know, North Carolina Central had a situation like this just last year where they were going against Alabama State in their first game of the season, where both teams are looking to make a statement. North Carolina Central, 1 game away from being MEAC champions last year, the same way they were the year prior. Going into last year's season, it felt like, okay, this is Walker Harris's season. This is Walker Harris under center. We want to see what's going to happen. Now it's no longer the first year of Walker Harris. We want to see if he's able to take that next step. There are so many parallels between North Carolina Central in 2024 versus North Carolina Central in 2025. And if you want to talk about parallels, their opponent is once again a team that is looking to take that next step. Though Southern was already the SWAC West champions, it felt like they were a step below Jackson State in 2024. Hey, no shame about it. Everybody was. But Southern isn't okay with that. Southern isn't accepting that. And they're trying to make that jump to where not only are they on that same level as Jackson State, they've surpassed. They've been able to beaten Jackson State. So this is definitely a definitive game, not only because it's the MEAC-SWAC Challenge, but because it's going to say a lot between 2 teams that are towards the top of their conference. So MEAC voted them second, North Carolina Central, and the SWAC voted Southern first in the West, but I think we all kind of put them behind Jackson State at the same time. Week 1 has a lot of games. So I'm just going to kind of go through the different lines. So the first one was Delaware State versus Delaware and Norfolk State versus Towson. Another week 1 matchup was Howard versus FAMU. Those are the trio of week 1 matchups that are going to define the conference. And I think these are good picks once again, especially when you start looking at the Delaware State and Norfolk State matchups. Because at first I kind of scrunched my face up. I said, I don't know. Like, I don't know how important those games are going to be. They're not they're out of conference games. They're not necessarily huge tradition games to me that I'm thinking about. I mean, the Norfolk State versus Towson series over the last couple of years has been interesting, but it's not moving the needle for me. And then I thought about it. The very first game of Delaware State and the very first game of Norfolk State is going to have so many eyes on it. That big game at Norfolk is going to be nationally televised. And I love that they made that call. But when I think about it, everything will be traced back. And you're going to see the second game that people are looking at for this. We don't know how Vic and Jackson are going to be as head coaches. But I do know that we're looking forward to their debut, and we're looking forward to them to play each other. And we'll talk about that latter matchup as we move forward, right? But I think that looking at this debut, they're kind of joined. They're joined together. That's the 2-part one that I was talking about earlier. Looking at their debut as a definitive matchup, yeah. Because when we go back and we finish talking about the MEAC 2025 season, we're going to talk about the first year of Vic, the first year of Jackson. We're not only going to talk about when they face each other, we're going to talk about the beginning of their tenure. Then you have FAMU versus Howard, which has a very similar feel as North Carolina Central versus Howard, or North Carolina Central versus Southern, excuse me. But I feel like FAMU versus Howard has that same feeling. Both teams are looking to bounce back. Both teams were in the Celebration Bowl just a year ago, and they both faltered in 2024. So you're looking at a real big similarity between these two squads. And I do want to see what happens. FAMU's returning back to the Orange Blossom Classic after a year hiatus. In general, I just think that these two teams are similar. These two teams are parallels. And we're going to see that again with a Howard matchup, because this isn't the last time we see the Bison on this list. And because that's a conference game, I'm going to spend more time on that one. You got South Carolina State versus North Carolina A&T. I thought this was a solid one. Not much for me to really dive in here. The Bulldogs versus the Aggies, I think that is a matchup that we want to see a lot, but I'm more interested in the North Carolina A&T side of it than I am South Carolina State. And since we're talking about the MEAC specifically, I'm going to just leave this one here and not give too much words on it. Then you have week 9, which is the matchup I was just teasing a little bit. Morgan State versus Howard. Next to South Carolina State versus North Carolina Central, there's not a game I'm more interested in, because this feels like the battle for third place. And I understand that's a little disrespectful, right? Like, I get it. But if the two top dogs are North Carolina Central and South Carolina State, and I think that battle is going to be for first place, and the loser probably gets second place. I think that Howard and Morgan State are the two teams that are most likely to fight those two teams, right? I think that Howard and Morgan State, if there's somebody who's going to sneak up and claim the title that we didn't expect, it'd be Morgan State or Howard. And I have my questions about Morgan State, but for me, this is the game that they have to win. I'm not saying that they should be okay with third place, but this is the game that they have to win, right? Like, I think that we're looking for a hierarchy. We have the top two teams, but who's that next team? Who's going to stake the claim as the top guys? Now, this is week 9. By this point, we may be looking at this game a tad bit different, but all in all, this is definitely a definitive matchup, because I think it's going to define the hierarchy of the conference. Then you have Norfolk State versus Delaware State. What needs to be said about this? What can be said about this? At the end of the day, it's Delaware State versus Norfolk State. It's Michael Vick versus Deshaun Jackson. I saw a pretty good interview. I don't remember where I saw it or who was doing it. I think it was HBCU Game Day. But basically, it was a conversation with Jackson about how fans should root, because you're going to have a lot of Philadelphia presence on there. I thought that was a very interesting angle of like, who do we root for? If you're not a Norfolk State fan, you're not a Delaware State fan, you're an Eagle fan trying to show up and show love. Who do you root for? And Jackson couldn't really answer that question, but there's not really an answer to it. But all in all, sorry, that is probably number 3 for me. Number 1 is obviously South Carolina State versus North Carolina Central. The second one, as far as how excited I am, is probably Morgan State versus Howard, because I think that is a game that is going to hold a lot of weight, is going to mean something. But then you have Vic versus Jackson. And the fact that I really highlight that game as coach versus coach as opposed to team versus team is the reason on why I have that third place. Though I'm very excited for the game, I don't know if I'm necessarily excited for the teams. I think I'm more so excited for the moment. I'm more excited for what it means. I'm more excited for the venue, the spectacle of it, the lead into it. Those are the things that have me excited before the season about Delaware State versus Norfolk State. It's not because I think either of these teams are championship contenders. That's the reason that I can't place it above a Morgan State versus Howard. Though I'm looking at this as a 2-man race in the MEAC, at the same time, that battle between Morgan versus Howard is going to define the hierarchy, like I said earlier. So that's why it gets the nod, in my opinion. And then lastly, you have North Carolina Central versus South Carolina State. And we talked about that on yesterday's episode, but I'll just keep it simple and plain. Before the season, this looks like the game that is going to decide who is going to be the MEAC champion. The winner of this game, I believe, goes to the Celebration Bowl. The loser of this game will be watching from home. That is the consequences of the matchup, and I'm excited for it. Those are the 8 games that define the MEAC season. I thought that this was a very well-written article. I thought he had some really good explanations. I'm a yapper, so I end up giving my explanations a little bit more than his, but if you want, I'll set an alarm. Got my phone on me. I'll set an alarm to make sure that I put the article in the description so that you can look at that as well. I thought it was really well done. But as we push forward, Eric Dooley's back. I know you thought you got rid of him. I know you thought you saw the last of Dooley, but you didn't. Edward Waters said we bring in the guy back. So let's break that down as we continue with Locked On HBCU. As we continue rolling, today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Now, maybe you want to go to the ballet. Maybe you want to go to the theater. There's a big time 3-day sequence of events out there in Dallas. You're going to have the Big 3 celebrity game and playoffs in Dallas at the American Airlines Center. And then you have the Dallas Wings, which do play in Arlington. Make sure you show love to the city. But you have the Dallas Wings that are playing on Friday. I'm going to try to go to one of those events. And you already know I done priced them on Game Time. You have the zone deal that allow you to be given. Now, you maybe don't want to pick it. You're indecisive. I see all these options. I don't know what to do. Game Time settles it for you. They pick a zone, or you pick a zone, and they tell you what the best seat there is. So for my indecisive people, Game Time's great for you. My people who just want to get out and do something, Game Time's good for you. For my people who at the end of the day just want to save a little bit of bank, Game Time's good for you. You can have fun and save money at the same time. All in pricing up front. I appreciate every part of Game Time, and you will too. Go ahead and download the app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDONCollege to get $20 off your first purchase. Use the code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first purchase. As we continue rolling on today's episode of Locked On HBCU, I appreciate you for making this your first listen of the day every day. For your second listen, make sure you're checking out Locked On NFL so that you can keep up to date with all of the biggest stories coming out of the preseason. Shedeur Sanders was a big one. We're always talking about him, and I don't think that we're done yet. But as we stand right here, we're not yet teasing our preseason action. Maybe we'll mention that at the end. But Eric Dooley is at Edward Waters, it appears. There was recently a video that was posted on social media, and people said, hey, is that Dooley? Surely looked like Dooley to me, and it was from an Edward Waters practice. And it feels almost like an Easter egg. I'm not saying they were trying to hide it. I'm not saying they were trying to trick anybody or fool anybody, but it does feel like seeing Dooley at this Edward Waters practice was a bit of an Easter egg. It feels like I feel like a regular Adrian Monk the way I detected this. Okay, I feel like I'm really picking through everything that's going on and then putting the pieces together, because Edward Waters has not updated their coaching staff. So we don't know what the staff is going to look like, but we do see that Brian Jenkins Jr. is actually adding his own staff, right? For those who don't know, Toriano Morgan has been the head coach for a couple of years at Edward Waters, and the expectation was that he was going to be the head coach in 2025. The expectation was set as he'd been the head coach all the way leading up. He had been the head coach until a couple of days after conference media day. So basically, he was the head coach for every piece of the offseason until we get to fall camp. And then he decides to take a job at Tennessee State. And when this news broke, the biggest story for us was the idea that, hey, this is why staff construction means something, because Brian Jenkins Jr. is going to have the opportunity to be the interim head coach. And this is a really good position, not only for him, but also for Edward Waters, because Edward Waters had a former coach on the staff already. So that's why I thought that this was a fantastic time to shine a light on staff construction. Jenkins benefited from this, and it seems like it's not something that he's going to leave behind. See, Jenkins was a former head coach at Bethune-Cookman, at Alabama State. So you're looking at Brian Jenkins Jr. as a coach who was very experienced, but he was as an assistant, right? He was an assistant at Edward Waters behind Coach Morgan. Then Coach Morgan leaves, Jenkins become head coach, and now Dooley's here. And Dooley is a former head coach, PV, Southern. He's had success in many places. Now, I think that people have spoiled on Dooley. It's almost incredible what the last 3 years have done to Eric Dooley. And when you really think about it, Dooley walked out of PV. I think he had pretty good stock. I think his stock was pretty high. He had a strong offensive coordinator tenure. He had led the Panthers to a SWAC championship berth, right? And then he goes to Southern, and he gets Southern to a championship. But you just look at the last 3 years, from his first year at Southern, his second year at Southern being cut short, especially that 2023 season. That 2023 season when he was at Southern, it felt like every single lick of goodwill that he had built up, like just imploded. I have not seen someone's reputation go downhill as fast as I've seen it happen with Eric Dooley without a scandal involved. This is pure football. This is pure leading of men. This is pure X's and O's. This is a guy who, when he left Prairie View, was looked at as, okay, this is a big loss for the Panthers. This is a big gain for the Jaguars. 2 years later, he's out of Southern. Not even a full 2 years. He's out of Southern. Terrence Graves takes over, and everybody loves Coach Graves. So it's kind of like that's more of the talking point. I don't feel like you really hear much about Dooley anymore in relation to Southern. Then he goes to Grambling, and he flames out there. It was bad. You have Eric Dooley calling plays for the Tigers until Mickey Joseph comes around and says, look, you're going to do it the way that I want it done. You're going to call the plays I want. You're going to call, like, basically saying, I'm going to take control of this whole situation. When I talked about Dooley and Joseph's relationship in last week, on one of the episodes last week, I seen a couple of comments. One saying, I don't know why Joseph ever trusted Dooley after what happened at Southern. And one talking about how he basically emasculated Dooley. Those two things work to me in conjunction, in the sense that there's no way I could have imagined somebody talking about Dooley's play calling the way that they did just 3 years ago. He was really strong as the OC. I assume that's going to be the role that he plays here. But once again, it's not, nothing set in stone. Nothing's on the website. So it's kind of difficult to project. But the assumption should be that he's going to be an offensive coordinator again. But yeah, it's just crazy to me that fans and his head coach would talk about Dooley this way throughout the season, and then also after the season. But he lands on his feet again. I'm not shocked. He does have a reputation, and he's going down to the D2 level. So it's a little bit different. I don't know if head coaching is ever back in his future. Though he had success at PV, his time at Southern was terrible. His time at Southern, though it includes a SWAC championship berth, it was just bad. It was not inspiring. Didn't feel like it had good leadership. It was extremely rocky towards the end, and it was a big blow up that ended the whole thing. People were excited to see him go. And if he does get a head coaching job, if he does get another OC job, I just don't know if he's going back to the FCS level. It feels like that time is over. You're going to need a lot of rehabilitation to sell Eric Dooley to another program in the SWAC. Maybe he gets to go to the MEAC or something. Coaches bounce around all the time. If Brian Jenkins Jr. keeps this job, then you probably see Dooley keep this job. But if he doesn't, Dooley may be looking for another source of employment. But it's going to be really interesting. It's going to be really interesting to see what it is that Dooley is able to do with this new gig. But as we move forward, we're going to take a brief insight into the preseason, because for 90%, 95% of former HBCU players, this is the most important time of the year. I'll break down why and also ask a couple of questions on what it is you're looking for as far as coverage goes as we continue with Locked On HBCU. As we're wrapping up today's episode of Locked On HBCU, I appreciate you for making this your first listen of the day every day, making it all the way to segment 3, and I thank you 2 times for that. Thank you. Thank you. HBCU athletes are not, and I specifically mean rookies, right? Like as you work your way up the roster in years, that's different. But specifically rookies and second-year players, third-year players, a lot of these guys that you'll see in the preseason, they're sitting here trying to make a job, trying to make a roster. You know, preseason football is not something that everybody is just looking towards. Like, oh man, I can't wait till I get to see the Bears in preseason, until you see a guy like Ian Wheeler, who is scoring touchdowns, coming back from a torn ACL earlier last year, right? Like these are stories that we follow, but because we're HBCU fans, these are athletes that we follow as well. I think the Wheeler story is a good example of a story that gets a lot of fanfare because he did tear his ACL. That was a big deal. He was looking good going into that preseason game, and I thought he looked solid in this preseason game. I think that you got new coaches, so it's not necessarily what you did last year. It doesn't really matter. It's part of the evaluation, but they didn't see you in training camp. They got the little bit of preseason that you were able to show, but now they got like Ben Johnson is there. But anyway, the point is, I was going to ask, how much do you guys even want me to talk about this? I don't feel like it's a big draw. I'm kind of surprised. I thought it would be something that people were more interested in, but let me know if you want me to talk about these individuals a little bit more. I will. But the point is that in preseason, though it's a time that a lot of us yawn, a lot of us say we're not watching that, we don't care. You can find games on Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, doesn't matter. But people in general aren't necessarily excited for what that week of action brings, or those weeks of action brings. For HBCU athletes, though, it's everything, because most of them are not starting off high. We didn't have a player drafted this year, right? Like the majority of our prospects go undrafted. So when you're talking about being an undrafted free agent, an undrafted rookie, you need guys who are going to step up, not only in practice, not only in training camp, but also when the lights come on. You need guys who are going to step up in the preseason. I obviously write for Who Dat Dish, as you see right here, as you hear at the beginning. We talked about the quarterback battle continuously at Who Dat Dish. And one of the things that I thought that Coach Moore said that was interesting is that this, not even interesting, it's known, but it's a good thing to highlight, is that preseason is it's just a part of the evaluation. And though we're talking about a quarterback battle and it's high profile, that's not necessarily exclusive to QBs, right? Like whether it's Elijah Williams or Ian Wheeler or Xavier Smith or Aaron Smith, right? What you do in preseason only means so much. To me, as a fan on the outside looking in, this feels like a more important time than practice. That's me though, right? That's me. I don't know how many practices in training camp equate to a game. I'd probably say 2 to 3 practices. But for me, if you can show up and play big in these moments, not only do you stand a better chance of making the roster, you stand a better chance of standing out and someone else wanting to add you to the roster, someone else wanting to add you to the practice squad. To me, a lot of our athletes aren't going to make key contributions unless you're a return specialist, not as a rookie. It just does not happen a lot of times because you're fighting to make the roster. So now you're at the bottom of the roster, and it takes a while before people get down to you. Unless you're running back. I think running back is pretty thin as far as how many you can keep. So you will see a third running back get some touches throughout the year, depending on your team. But yeah, this is important because you're trying to make that roster, and it's a big difference. So I know preseason gets scoffed at. I know preseason gets laughed at, but I do think it's important that we highlight how important it is for our athletes. It just is. The situation we find ourselves in 9 times out of 10, you are going to need preseason to make the roster. You need preseason to show special team capability. You need preseason to show how you can perform against other teams that aren't your own. It's extremely valuable. I know as fans, we don't like to watch it, but as from a pure X's and O's, pure football standpoint, there's not a more valuable spot because you don't even get to week 3, week 4 if you can't make it past week 2 of the preseason. So tomorrow we'll probably talk about a little bit of what Michael Vick sees for the Norfolk State offense as far as style of play. Izzy Carter chimes in as well. And just know they're looking for explosiveness all around. In the meantime, in between time, until the next time that we hear each other, family, take care. Stay blessed. Peace.